Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. So I'll let Dr. Riddell answer the questions that you posed before the break.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, concerning the wild salmon policy, I guess one aspect that we haven't talked about very much is that there are samples routinely taken at the test sites for stock composition, and that information is analyzed in season. And so if we were to think forward in terms of how you would incorporate this type of information under wild salmon policy, it would be that you would track some of the conservation units that you may be having to get them out of the so-called red zone up into the amber zone where they're considered to be safe from immediate risk of extinction, sort of thing. And so you may well interject new management objectives to recognize specific conservation units in real time. That is not really done at this time, but it could be taken into account. Mike, do you want to add?
Yeah, just to add, in fact, there is an example of how it is done in real time right now, and it relates to Early Stewart, which I guess actually might be more than one CU, I think, because there's a couple of lakes. So quite often tactic, because the Early Stewart has been at a very low run size in recent years, there's a strategy or harvest tactic called an Early Stewart closure. So the idea is to delay the start of fisheries until the Early Stewart sockeye have passed, and the stock ID combined with the acoustics can tell you when, maybe 90% of the abundance is passed, which would then mean that you could start fisheries that would not impact the Early Stewart as adversely as might be. Early Stewart's a bit of a unique case because it has such a distinct timing, but the opportunities are there for other applications of that nature.
And your second question, sir, on the escapement surveys, I don't know that we were clear on exactly what you were looking for. We are using, well, I shouldn't say we anymore, the department is using hydroacoustics in some freshwater spawning escapement estimations. So the large programs where you have to conduct mark recapture over a 6 or 8 week period, they tend to become very, very expensive. They're accurate and they're very precise, but they're very expensive. So we have now developed the application used once in the Quesnel and the Horsefly River and annually now in the Chilco River. So the department has been watching for opportunities to reduce costs and use funds elsewhere by putting these high quality hydroacoustic systems in to better enumerate escapement. You still have problems with species composition and so they have an added little burden there, because even in Chilco you have sockeye and Chinook in the same timing and areas, and you'd have different, well, maybe not as much in horsefly, but horsefly very likely could have sockeye and maybe some coho issues in that area, but they wouldn't be abundant enough to cause an error with the abundance of sockeye. And then, is there another question we can answer for you on that?
I apologize. It may have come up in this context, the DBEs, and I think Mr. Lapointe was talking about Quaylark and Mission having some bearing upon tightening up on information with respect to that. But I had understood, perhaps wrongly, that in addition, the escapement surveys would be part of the picture of trying to tighten up on the information about these issues. And I may have connected a whole bunch of different dots I shouldn't have.
No, that's okay. So in the context of Brian's comments, then, to the extent that a DITSN would provide a more robust estimator, say in a system like Quesnel, where there's multiple streams that aren't always surveyed with intense methods, then having a system-wide estimate with a DITSN at Quesnel would really shore up the spawning ground part of that DBE thing. So you actually haven't really misconnected things, I don't think. The only other thing I'd say about spawning escapements is that in the scheme of things, you talk about the mid-channel sampling acoustically being an in-season tool. When you're talking about spawning escapements, you're talking about an outcome of the management at the end of the season, which is obviously critical. It's the primary objective and also the thing that drives what comes back in the future. So it's in-season main stem stuff versus upstream stuff, which are the outcomes, which we always see within the context of wild salmon policy. You have to understand something about the distribution of those. So it has to be, so in other words, a main stem program couldn't replace the distribution information. So two other quick points on terminology, just because some of my hydroacoustic staff are going to probably say we're misspeaking here. Dual frequency is actually a technology that came after single beam, and it's not the same as split beam. So I think when Brian was using the word dual frequency, what he really meant was split beam in most of the contexts which he used. And then this DIDSON is, I think, dual frequency identification sonar is what that word actually stands for. So just for the record, just to make sure that people aren't confused when they read the transcripts.
Thanks. Do those answers cover what you need? Okay, thank you. One document I meant to take Dr. Riddell to before the break is a document found at tab 12, and it's titled, it's CAN 171-500, and it's titled A Brief History of Fraser River Hydroacoustics. It's written by John Holmes, George Cronkite, and Herman Eisenhofer. Dr. Riddell, you've read this document?
Yes, I have.
And is it a reasonably accurate summary of the history of the hydroacoustic program in the Fraser?
Yes, I think it's excuse me. I think it's an excellent summary. It really captures the two time periods with a few graphs for comparison, and really highlights the sort of sequence of development in hydroacoustics.
All right, so as a useful outline of the history, I would like this marked as the next exhibit, please.
357.
All right, I'd like to move on now to a different area, the Integrated Assessment Program, and these questions are primarily directed at Dr. Riddell. In 2006, Dr. Riddell, while you were still at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, you proposed an integrated Fraser River assessment concept to senior management in the Pacific region. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and I have a copy of an outline of that program, which you should be able to find at tab 17.
Sorry. I've got it anyhow.
You
Yes.
have that?
Yeah.
Okay. Who was this proposal, why was it developed, and who was it presented to, this proposal?
Well, it was developed because I was division head of salmon assessment and freshwater ecosystems at the time, and so I was considering the repeated sort of concerns about the accuracy and issues in the Fraser sockeye assessments, and I was increasingly concerned about the credibility and profile of the department as this repeatedly came up publicly. And at the time, really looking at using current technologies that were available to improve how we actually do the core assessment. It was developed by myself and Al Cass and presented to the Senior Regional Management Committee, at that time managed by Paul Sprout.
All right, thank you. I'd like this marked, please, as the next exhibit.
358.
Okay, and what happened with this proposal?
We proceeded to implement this proposal. It was implemented as a science program, and the scale of the program is such that there were a number of parties involved, not just the department.
And I don't know if we've made this clear yet in the hearings, but a science program, a project that's funded through science is typically not an ongoing program. Is that correct? It would be almost like an experimental program that would maybe, if it was successful, be then moved over funding-wise to management and carried on through management funding as an ongoing program. Is that correct?
That is the theory.
That's the theory. Okay.
In this case, if we continued it as a science program, because one component is taking a long-term look at the risk Fraser sockeye are to climate change, and how are we going to actually evaluate the upstream mortality issue and the animal's behavior.
All right.
So there was both a science and a management component, but the thinking at the time was definitely that if this worked, it would become a significant in-season management program.
All right, but it did start its funding life as a science project.
Yes.
Okay. And when did that program start to get underway? Was it 2007?
Yes, in 2007, and this is building off some work that started before 2007 because of the the late Run Fraser sockeye mortality studies that were being funded by the Pacific Salmon Commission through the Southern Endowment. And so there was some radio tagging going on in the river. This program, as all of its components, was starting to be implemented in 2007. It really wasn't fully implemented until 2008.
And this program is still ongoing, is that correct?
It was ongoing through 2010 because of the funding through a number of endowment funds and the Pacific Salmon Foundation and a significant sum from the Southern Endowment Fund. It is currently not planned to be fully implemented in 2011. All right. With the exception that we've already talked about, is quailark, and the Pacific Salmon Foundation has maintained some money put aside to do some more radio tagging if the opportunity exists.
All right, well, let's go through what is in that program, and then we can talk about what components you think should be continued. So as it was conceived and implemented in 2007, what were the components of this program?
Well, basically, this is really what we would call a mark recapture program. Mark recapture statistics are used around the world in all sorts of different species, and so the statistics are pretty well worked out. The innovations here were things as simple as using the fish wheel and trying to apply that in the Fraser River to see if you could get a random sample of fish without damage from gill nets, etc. And that would be in good health, so you could give them a tag with a radio tag and then follow their survival. The radio tagging was a continuation of some work that had been conducted in the past, some expertise through LGL Consulting and Carl English, and then Dr. Scott Hinch's group at UBC. They're doing an extensive amount of work in looking at the upstream survival of sockeye and the physiological stress on the animal. To do mark recapture, you must account for all of the marks and where they're being lost from the system. So you have to implement catch monitoring and sampling of all fisheries. And that's so if there are native and sport fisheries between where you applied the tag and where you're going to estimate the marked-unmarked ratio, you must sample for the loss of tags at that point. So in this case, it was the fishing that could occur between Mission and quailark. At quailark, we've talked extensively about the Ditchin program. The innovation here that we initially had was one of a directional antenna for the radio tag in the water and aligned through the Ditchin beam. And the intention of this is that you would know exactly when a radio tag went by, and then because of the clarity of the Ditchin, you could get an exact estimate of the unmarked fish going by with that marked fish. And the final component then is that to study things like upstream migration, look at the difference between estimate concerns, study the effects of climate change. Then we had receivers strategically placed throughout the watershed so that we could track each individual fish with a radio tag.
Okay.
So I call it, there were 5 integral programs.
This is the Fraser Salmon Legacy Project. It's a presentation. Is this Legacy project the project that you've just been describing?
Yes, and it's called the Legacy Program because this is actually presented in 2009, and it served 2 purposes. At the time, we were dealing with the downturn in the economic cycle, and we had lost a lot of money coming from the Pacific Salmon Commission's Southern Endowment Fund. And so we're going to the Pacific Salmon Endowment Fund to get money from another source to pay for it. And at the same time, this level of detail was gone through because the Pacific Salmon Endowment Fund was changing its board of directors, going from Rick Hansen as the chair, setting up a new structure managed through the Pacific Salmon Foundation.
Right, and I'll have this marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 359.
If we turn to page 4 of this exhibit, that sets out the 5 components that you just ran through with us. It should be on the screen in front of you.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And you talked about mark recapture, but I'm not sure that we've yet had an explanation about what that actually means. If you can give us just a thumbnail of how those programs are designed to work.
Yeah, sure. Well, initially designed this, and as you've heard from the discussion with Mike and I, we probably don't need to really go to this extent anymore because the match between Quaylark and Mission is so good. The initial intention here was one of, you put tags on at a particular site, and this case we were using it as a fish wheel. The fish wheel was actually located either at Crescent Island, just below the Mission Highway Bridge, is actually about 2 or 3 kilometers below it, and then the fish would be released from the fish wheels, and our sampling then, to make any population estimate, you have to have a secondary site of sampling where you can determine the ratio of the marked fish to the unmarked, in this case the radio tag to the not tagged. And once you know that, plus the number of tags that you've released them, and can account for the numbers of tags that were removed in between those two sampling sites, with a couple of assumptions that can be tested, you can actually make an estimate of the population that passed your point of tagging. All right, and so this would have included the Mission hydroacoustic site, which would have been right above that.
Okay.
Now, there are some basic assumptions, and this is where much of the discussion has gone on for a couple of years. The one that we struggled with a lot is we thought the fish wheels would give us an opportunity to get a very good random sample. And it turns out, both because of the sampling nature of fish wheels in a river, the fish are very, very sensitive to vibration and noise. And so we had some concerns developed there. And the one that's really been, I think, most revealing to us is the sensitivity of the animals to temperature. And that, so in 2010, for example, the sensitivity of that is so great that we actually put the tags on in the marine environment now. And that, so there's a real almost knife-edge survival. If you tag around up to 18 degrees Celsius, then we had reasonable survivals. If you tagged above 18.5, then we immediately had significantly higher survival or mortalities. And so you can't really have the thermally based mortality due to handling and try to study the natural environment at the same time. So we had to remove that handling stress from the fish.
What was the cost of running this program?
Well, the costs differed a bit in the development, of course, because that large fish wheel in your package, which is pictured in slide 6, that had to be completely designed and rebuilt because the small fish wheels proved to not collect enough animals. So the total cost, in my recall, is roughly $3 million over about 3.5 years. But some of that now, of course, is all in these capital investments for equipment. The radio tags are not cheap in themselves, so there is a significant annual cost.
All right, in this program, you've excuse me, describe some of the funding sources for it, but who runs whose program is this? Is this a DFO program? Is it a Salmon Commission program? Is it a Salmon Foundation program? Like, whose program is this?
Well, it's really all of the above. It's not really the Pacific Salmon Foundation's program because the foundation is not around to do science. I managed it because of initiating it within DFO. But the information is shared openly amongst all parties. There is some limitation on how quickly this is because if people are doing scientific investigation within it, then we do recognize their involvement to publish that information. LGL, the consulting firm that actually manages most of the program in season, they're the principal group that manage the radio tag data. They maintain the database, create a lot of these graphics you see on distribution, but that information is always open to other members of the study to participate, and it's open to anyone in the Fraser Basin that we talk with.
There's some concern about funding, and I take it there's a concern about whether Quaylark, which is a component of this, will continue to be funded, but there's also concern about where the funding will come for the other components. Is that right?
Well, yes. We had to be creative in finding funds. We even have private donors who liked the idea so much that in 1 year they contributed almost $100,000 to this because they believed that it was going to improve the situation in the Fraser. And that doesn't happen every year. The concern here now is whether we need to continue doing it at this scale, and that because it was done as, what is the utility, what can we learn from it? For example, going outside to put the tags on in the marine environment, that may reduce some costs, but it has others where you have to have access to vessels to get tags on sockeye, etc. And that, so The big costs are labor, and that on an annual basis for running the fish wheels. And that if we don't use the fish wheels, then we give up some of the stock composition information that we talked about yesterday. Not stock, I should call it really species composition. And that, but I mean, the program could still be put together. The quail arc discussion with DFO was the major change in the sense that that had always been their significant contribution to this legacy program. And if they're not doing it now, then quail arc could continue on its own.
So quail arc could continue on its own?
It could continue on its own because it has its own merit.
Oh, I see,
Right,
sorry.
right.
Well, I think we should probably go through the program. You've done an assessment, I take it, of these different components to see if they are useful or whether you want to continue with them. So maybe we can do that now. Running through the components that you've identified, what are the values of those different components, having now implemented this program for a few years, and do you see a need to continue them?
Well, I mean, if you go through each, starting with the fish wheel, I think we just commented that there are issues with the fish wheel because of the temperatures in the rivers now. There are still some nagging concerns about how random a sample of sockeye the fish wheels along the shore were providing. It may be better to simply apply the tags in the ocean. Now, there is a direct cost of tagging in the ocean if you have fisheries. So this year, with the unexpectedly large run, we lost over 50% of the tags applied in Johnson Strait and Wantafuga to fisheries. And now you can recover some of those, but you don't get those fish going into the river where you can get then the upstream migration information, right? So you save some money someplace and you spend more elsewhere. And that the fish wheel may not actually be continued this year. We don't have any plans to do that. I have kept some money within the Pacific Salmon Foundation because we are still working to see with the Yale First Nation if the fish wheels could be used at quail arc to get a better estimate of species composition. The canyon at quail arc actually is quite a good site for a fish wheel to use because the animals are very shore oriented. The radio tagging has proved to be extreme.
I'm just thinking it might be useful if we went piece by piece, and maybe Mr. Lapointe could provide his
Sure.
comments as well. On the fish wheels, do you have anything to add?
I think Brian.
Oh, your mic's off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Brian captured the main issues. I mean, conceptually, I think the design of this was excellent, but what happens is you put these things in the water and you learn, and so I think we really were learning, and so what Brian's going to be telling you, and this is a good example of the fish wheel, we learned, and started with a small fish wheel, thought we could catch more fish with the big fish wheel, could catch more fish, but then you talk about trying to look at climate change in the warming Fraser River, and you say, well, if we're putting tags in the river that we're trying to track the changes in, that's going to create a challenge for us. So I have nothing more to add on the fish wheel.
Thank you. Sorry, moving to the next, radio tagging. I mean, that might tie in with what you've already talked about, but you can...
Well, the radio tagging is proven to be one of the most informative. Assuming we can get around this bias, if you're handling fish and adding mortality to it, going back to 2006, actually, there was a very large marine tagging program, and they did lose tags to fisheries outside. But the reason I bring it up is that once you detected a fish moving past the receivers at Mission, then we had a very good accounting for those fish all the way up the rivers. And that, so if there was something to be continued under climate change, then the radio tagging really does provide a really useful tool to monitor what's going on in the river. We are definitely seeing patterns of where you're losing fish in the river that you could not possibly really detect without using the shore-based receivers and applying radio tags. 3 significant places where we tend to have problems in losing tags. We've only really come to that by doing this over a few years. So the radio tags are certainly things that if we can find a way to continue that resources, the money for that, it's very informative. We are using the radio tag information in building the first in-river management model for Fraser sockeye as well. And Mike's staff, in all the discussion, we've talked about managing fish to Mission, basically, so that we have an accounting of fish at that time. Beyond there, until the fish are on the spawning grounds in the past, there's really not an active management program. And that, so there is an estimate of what passes Mission, but then there are fisheries that are conducted, catches that are sampled, biological samples taken. There's not an active management of what's going actually on in the river. So using all the information that we've acquired in this program and working with Simon Fraser University and some modelers there, we are building a risk model for saying, what if a First Nation in the Upper Basin signs an agreement to have 2,000 or 3,000 food and social ceremonial fish every year? What would that mean in terms of really trying to manage to directly provide those fish to that community? And so you can actually build a model that, using the information in the lower river and what you know about loss in river, what would it take to deliver fish to that community?
And that, just I don't want to take you off topic, but just for reference, Exhibit 337, this is a concept for that program that you're referring to.
John Cox, yeah. I recognize it as being that, Brian. I don't know if you're familiar. This is Sean Cox's in-river model proposal.
Yeah, this is a couple. Yeah, that's a couple of years old, but yes, that's the program.
Okay, thank you. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to identify that for the record. Sorry, and we can go back to the screen that you had up prior.
Did you have anything more on the mark recapture, Brian? I don't really have anything more to add on it. I think the main challenge, as Brian said, is the effect of the tag, and by moving the marine areas, you reduce the effect of the tag, but then you have this incremental cost, which is, annoying, I guess, in terms of making it work. So
Does it provide any different information as to counts at Quaylark than what you would have just with the regular Didson at Quaylark?
Not counts at Quaylark per se. You have the counts at Quaylark and the counts at Mission. One of the challenges with doing the in-river tagging, and it seemed like the most acute effect of the tag was in the area between Mission and Sawmill relative to the marine area fish. So it made the mark recapture part of that challenging from the standpoint of the fact that there's this tag effect that occurs. Now that you're in marine areas, I guess we're going to look at that data this winter, I guess, and see. I suspect the marine area tagging may have something informative because you don't have to worry about that tag effect between Mission and Sawmill. But we haven't done that work yet, so we have to do that analysis.
An example of where it would provide you an incremental bit of information. And we have talked about Quaylark and the difference in terms of the numbers with Mission, because there are some populations that diverge from the river in between. If they were large populations and where your tagging would capture some of them, you could look at the distribution of the radio tags to be somewhat informative of what portion of the population is going into those other tributaries. Now, if you were talking about the Chilliwack, summer sockeye, that's a pretty small population, and the likelihood of getting a tag on that is fairly low. But if it was the Harrison River sockeye that are now up in the hundreds of thousands abundance, then there's probably a good chance that you'll tag a few of those. And that, so whenever you're talking about ratios like that, you really need to look at the numbers of animals that you have a likelihood of tagging, because it could be very, very sensitive to small sample error. And that. So I think that's all we need on the radio tagging. Quaylark, we spent quite a bit of time talking about, and we'd assume that it's proceeding. The catch monitoring, this program has worked very closely with DFO, and it will continue, and that the emphasis on the tag recovery and the reward program will simply be reduced. Catch sampling and catch monitoring is a routine task conducted in river by DFO. We have done work with them more closely in the last couple of years to try and identify exactly why tagged fish aren't making it through a couple of fishing locations. And that, is it repeated encounters of nets? Is it just something to do with how the tag is handled? Is it because we didn't get the tag back from particular fishers and so on? And so they were doing a lot more work on that in the last couple of years. But in the absence of the tags, if that doesn't continue, then we would still continue catch monitoring. And then the radio tracking through the river system, again, really dependent on whether you do that work or not. There is a long-term cost to the department, well, to Canada, whoever pays for it at this point, because we have been very, very fortunate to get almost all of our receiver equipment from the Columbia Basin. A number of the power utility groups down there do very extensive radio tagging to study the effects of the dams on the migration behavior of fish returning. And when they stopped doing those programs, because of the contact that LGL had with them down there, they provided all of that equipment to us basically for free. And that, so where we've had anywhere from 27, I think, to about 35 receivers, we now, I think, have lost 23 of them that are going back for studies in the United States. So to continue that work, we would have to buy receivers.
So 23 were loaned on a short-term basis only, and they have to go back.
Well, we did it on an annual basis, basically, because they weren't certain exactly when they'd have to do something. But each year, they were very generous in providing them to us.
And when will those have to go back? Is that for the 2011?
They're gone.
Oh, they're gone. Okay.
They're gone.
So were they in place for 2010?
Yes. Yeah.
So what's being contemplated for 2011?
Well, if we have money and we proceed with the radio tagging, then we would look to see a group like Pacific Salmon Foundation, again, might be able to buy some of the receivers and start to acquire these over time. Community groups that are interested in particular areas, these are not really expensive. The current models are about $8,000 a piece, and that. And you can, even if you have 11 or 14, whatever that difference really is at this point, you could put those in a very strategic location and capture most of the distribution of the tags.
And do you think that the data received from that upriver monitoring is useful for that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the only way to really test the model, and it provides us the data to put it in. It gives us information on mortality, but as well as migration rates. Where do they hold in the river? And that, so there's a lot of information that is being acquired by the radio tagging.
Is some of this information received through the in-river monitoring the kind of information that would be useful in trying to flesh out some of the DBEs that we talked about earlier?
Has been used extensively in the late run in particular, but also for summer runs in 2005. It wasn't part of this program, but an initial radio tracking program that was conducted in that year. In 2006, the rates of loss were actually used to back calculate how many fish should have been at mission, because it appeared that we had a low bias at mission. So it's been used very extensively. The pattern of mortality of late run sockeye with respect to river entry timing that we talked about, I think, when I was here last week, is very well documented from the mortality rates of these tags related to the river entry date. So in other words, the fact that almost none of the fish that were entered the river prior to the 14th of August actually made it to the spawning grounds, where you see a very dramatic increase in that survival rate as you look at later arriving fish. So as Brian said, it's been very freely shared and used quite broadly by a lot of different folks in relation to these issues.
Thank you. The next area I'd like to cover, which I think is my last area, is recommendations from...
Ms. Baker, can I just ask a couple of quick questions?
Sure.
One is, I'm assuming that none of these programs you've addressed are used or have been used for out-migration.
That's correct. There have been some programs done related to out-migration, some very recently, in fact, on the Chilco, but this one does not address that specific issue.
Okay. And when you're talking about the radio tags, when you say mortality, are you talking about recovering tags from fish that have been caught, or the ability to recover tags from fish who simply die in the river system?
It's both, really.
Okay.
What you get from a radio tag data by itself is the number of tags that made it to the spawning grounds, the number of tags that passed various points. So that ratio would be, depending upon how you calculate a mortality rate or survival rate, depending upon what you use. The tricky part is to try to assign why the fish that didn't make it, what was the reason that they didn't make it? Was it catch? Was it natural mortality? What was the cause? Obviously, if you get that fish from a fisherman who's caught it, you know that it's clearly a fishing mortality. And there's also work done in relation to if you don't have a recovery, but you know that fish went missing in a reach when there was an intensive fishery ongoing, and you look at the harvest rates that were associated with that fishery, you may be able to draw an inference that was a fishing mortality. One of the areas where I think we could improve if we continue in the future is have a more intensive catch sampling so that we can really sort that out. Right now it's a little bit, I don't know if circular is the right word, but so the mission escapement number is used for the abundance, the observed catches are used for the catches, and the ratio of those provides a harvest rate. That's fine in a science sense. Like, I think that we would accept that that's good. But in the political climate that we're in the river, then you have to ask, well, if those are the two pieces of primary data, and those are the pieces that people are concerned about, there's a bit of a lack of independence there. So I'm not saying it's not valid scientifically. I'm just saying that a better way might be to just have a test area, like a reach of the river, where you do have a receiver on one side, a receiver on the other side, very intense sampling to get that mark rate, the what do I want to say, the reporting rate of the number of fish that are caught. So it's separate from the pieces of information that have sometimes been part of the controversy, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I think we could do a more extensive job, but obviously when you're talking about the Fraser watershed, it's not a trivial task.
But that is being done. That's exactly what's being done.
Sure.
I mean, the other verification you have by using multiple tools, by having the marked to unmarked ratio at Quaylark, we can sample the upriver fisheries, and if someone tells us that, well, we caught 20,000 sockeye, then we can say, well, you should have 7 tags for us. Right? I'm making these numbers up, but and in most cases we are within plus or minus a tag. Right? Sometimes we actually have more, sometimes we have one less, but if you actually look at catch estimate and total number of tags, it's been very, very close each year. So we are doing exactly what Mike says, and this year we put particular emphasis on an area around Bridge Rapids, and the intensity there was to look at what is the interaction. Are the fish being caught, encountering the net multiple times but not being caught, so that they're not going by but they're dying? Or are they actually all being taken out of the river as catch? All right, and you really have to actually be there to get that intensive sampling. But just to give you an idea of the extent you can take this to, we have 2 sites where we're looking at fishing pressures and trying to separate effects. But the other interesting one is in the Thompson River, the fish are actually dying mostly at the outlet of Kamloops Lake. So they've made it through the canyon, which is a significant pressure. It can be extremely warm if you're going through there in the summer.
Talk about Thompson Canyon now, Brian, just Thompson and Fraser, right?
Well, you're above the Fraser Canyon, then you're through the Thompson Canyon and up to the outlet of Kamloops Lake. And we're seeing a significant loss of tags at that point. That actually is a resting point, that people in the area know that the animals come through there, and before they enter Thompson Lake, they hold there for a while, and it's quite possible that some of the animals are succumbing. Now, the other thing we're doing with the radio tags, and David, I don't know if he's still here, but he'll talk about it today probably, we have what's called a button tag, and it is simply glued on the back of the radio tag, and it tells us in a very, very short time interval the entire thermal history of the fish once you recover that tag. And so we can see fascinating things about how they actually use the lakes. And they come in and they go down and they'll hold for a while at cool temperature, and they'll come back up and they'll move and they'll go down again. And so the tool, I mean, there's probably years of study in really capturing all this data, but it's all been extremely useful and informative.
Just 2 brief questions following from what you just said, Dr. Riddell. One is, when you use the term "we," I'm not sure which hat you're wearing.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. I do get frequently confused. I call myself "we" in this case because we still are involved through the Pacific Salmon Foundation, but the program really is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and David is Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So the button tag is his information. That's the department's data.
Okay, but the Pacific Salmon Foundation is a partner or has an involvement, but
we are a partner. We've paid a large portion of the funds in the past 3 years.
I see.
And that's through the Pacific Salmon Endowment Fund. There's some donors, but the major fund is the Fraser Salmon and Watersheds Program, which is a major program within the Pacific Salmon Foundation, funded by federal government and the BC Living Rivers Fund from the province.
And finally, just a quick question. How engaged are the First Nations on the Fraser in the programs that you've described?
Within this program, there are a couple of groups that are very involved and others that are interested in returning tags, so not as directly involved. Matsqui First Nation are the people that man the fish wheels, and in the last couple of years, we've tried to work with the department to allow them to use the fish wheels as a fishing platform. And then the Yale First Nation is very involved with Quaylark. And then in the sampling of the catch throughout the river system, of course, there are First Nation monitors for the catch reporting and recovery of tags. The receiver monitoring, not very much. That's really been managed by LGL and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And anything else they've been, I think that's the major involvement of them.
Recommendations that have been made in past commissions to see how those have been dealt with. You should have in front of you Exhibit 14, which is a table of recommendations and responses prepared by Canada. You have that?
Yes.
These are recommendations from the WAPEL review, and then 252 is recommendations from Williams, both dealing with some of these issues. So starting with 244.
Exhibit 14.
It's Exhibit 14, page 244, recommendation number 6. Recommendation number 6,
Yes.
this is from WAPEL. Again, that the Government of Canada ensures as a matter of priority that the Mission Hydroacoustic Station be equipped with the latest technology. Fine. And then the next part, establish additional acoustic estimation stations at various strategic locations in the Fraser and Thompson rivers to accomplish quantitative estimates of fish and their stock identity. We did talk about some of the sites that were evaluated after 1992. Were there any additional sites looked at following this recommendation?
What is the year?
This is
What is the year?
2005.
Yeah, so the Boston Bar feasibility study would have been done after that.
All right, so the one you've already described.
That's right,
today.
yes.
Okay. And the page 252, again, reference to Boston Bar or Quaylark. So this, again, is the evidence that you've already given today about your evaluation of the Boston Bar site?
With respect to Boston Bar, that's the only work that I know that's been done there, and Quaylark we've already talked about.
And
So.
Quaylark was reestablished following the Williams Commission.
Yes.
We turned earlier to don't put away Exhibit 14, but just put it to one side. We talked earlier about a workshop that was held in 2007 by the Salmon Commission. If that could be put up again, that's document at tab 10. That's it. Was this workshop done following the Williams and the WAPEL reviews and in response to them to look at some different sites?
In part, it was also in part to inform another ongoing project that was probably a result of those reviews, and that was development of a integrated Fraser River sockeye stock assessment. So there was a monies provided to DFO to design or develop a framework for choosing between all the potential projects that might be proposed for, particularly in river, but also in general. And so this workshop was in part to inform that framework so that there'd be a discussion of at least the hydroacoustic side of those potential projects.
I think it's CAN 23 to 24, but in the document itself it would be page 17, I think. There's Upper Fraser River Hydroacoustic Site. What do you know about that assessment?
Just what I heard from Dave Levy at this workshop. I do know that they were exploring, I don't believe it was Ditson, I think it was split beam technology for application at the area near Prince George. And one of the things that you encounter when you start moving these things up the river in terms of cost benefit is, these programs are not inexpensive to run on an annual basis. I mean, to have, even if it's Ditson, you have, Ditsons are about $80,000 each. There's a capital cost, there's a operating cost, and so the challenge becomes, okay, what's the management application or the applications being used, and is the cost consistent with that? The DNA sampling associated with this program, and DNA for us cost us about $19 a fish. So you start adding this stuff up, and so I think, and you could ask David to talk to this, but I think his conclusion was perhaps this program, while it was feasible to conduct at this location, might not have been justifiable relative to the cost of the program, but he'd be best to speak to that.
But the Salmon Commission or Department of Fisheries and Ocean haven't pursued a site?
Not that I'm aware of it beyond this study. No, this was a feasibility study and there's nothing ongoing.
Right. This is I'm just going to leave that those proceedings for a moment and ask Dr. Riddell about a post-array system. Is that also a hydroacoustic kind of project, and what is it, and has it been explored?
POST is not hydroacoustics. POST stands for the Pacific Ocean Shelf Tracking. And what it is passive receivers that are set on the ocean bottom, or at least they're moored on the bottom. And you have active sonic tags that are put in fish. And as the fish passes over the array or the string of receivers, that signal from the fish is detected and retained in the receiver's data bank. And then you have to actually have people that will are trying to go out, locate the array, and they put basically call it a coupling system that goes down and triggers the data upload from the receiver to the receiving information system on the boat. And POST has become the sort of name of the group that looks after that technology. It was largely developed by a fellow named David Welsh working with Vemco, a Canadian company. And David has since gone out on his own and as a private consultant. And so there's a group that is actually housed at the Vancouver Aquarium that manages the POST program.
And is that POST program being used now in terms of Fraser River assessment, sockeye assessment?
Well, sort of a yes, no. And again, not in management. I think that's true.
Yeah, that'd be fair to say, not in in-season management, sure.
It is in science. Some of the university programs, for example, they do have arrays set in the lower part of the Fraser, and I believe 2 towards Mission. And they are used for studies of adult salmon coming in and looking at their migration rates upriver. And there has been some research conducted on juveniles, particularly coho and steelhead. And last year, for the first time, the Pacific Salmon Foundation, DFO, and UBC applied a POST technology on juvenile choco sockeye smolts. So not in management, definitely in some science programs.
And maybe just add one specific Fraser reference is that acoustic tags have been used in the late run sockeye issue. There's a bit of a yin-yang between acoustic tags and radio tags. Acoustic tags have to actually are currently at least surgically implanted in the fish. There's actually surgery conducted on the fish to insert the tag. Radio tags are actually pushed through the mouth into the stomach, basically. So there's that trade-off. You can't detect radio tags in salt water, whereas acoustic tags you can detect in salt water clearly. So in the late run application with the Fraser, it was being able to detect the fish off the mouth of the Fraser that the acoustic tags were valuable, because you couldn't do that with a radio tag. So it's mainly in the late run application, other than juvenile stuff that Brian mentioned, that the acoustic tags have provided some value.
Are there any limitations of using the POST technology in river?
There are in fact associated with that project these hydrophones, as they're called, because they're listening for the tag. In the main stem Fraser, there was an array at Mission, there was an array at the Harrison. There were a number of arrays that can be used in freshwater. So there's no limitation in freshwater to use them. You have to have the receiver and you have to be able to retrieve the information, but it can work in freshwater fine.
And are there any limitations around, or any impacts from the tag size used in this kind of program?
That mainly relates to the juvenile application. Right now, the Chilco study is the most recent one. I think the smallest fish that they were comfortable putting those tags in was around 120 millimeters or 110 millimeters. Average 1-year-old Chilco smolt would be about 80, so they're not quite at the tag is not quite small enough to be confident that it wouldn't affect a fish that's more of the average size in Chilco. So it's mostly a juvenile issue primarily.
Well, I mean, the tag size and duration is the trade-off, and there are some limitations that we encountered last year. For example, if you're dealing with adults and you want to extend battery life, you only need to have the signal maybe generate every 30 seconds or even 1 minute. So you can actually have a prolonged battery life doing it that way. But if you're coming down the Fraser River and if you are moving with the current, then what we did is had the tags all reprogrammed so that they were actually putting out a signal every 11 or 12 seconds. All right, and so that really reduced the battery life. But the limitation in river is one of background noise. And so there are some areas, if you have a lot of cobble moving through on the ground, that actually generates a lot of background noise that you have trouble detecting the signal against. And you have to have the signal be transmitted as it goes past the transponder, and it would have to be within about 100 meters. And so it is a bit of a trick in terms of how many transponders you need in a river to look at downstream migration. The adults, you can just put in more tags, it's less stressful. But there clearly are some limitations.
There's one other value actually mentioned on the Fraser, that it's limited by dollars more than anything else, but tags were put on cultus sockeye. These sockeye were reared to a certain size to make them big enough to handle a tag. And they have a technology with the tag where they can actually make the tag be dormant, so to save battery life basically. So tag was emitting its sounds while the fish were out migrating, going out past the detection receivers up in southern Georgia Strait and northern Georgia Strait and up the shelf, and then went dormant and then turned back on about the time they would come back as adults. And about 2 years ago, I think it was the first time we saw an actual demonstration of this technology where 100 cultus sockeye were tagged, and sure enough, 2 years later, because it takes them 2 years in their ocean migration, 2 of them came back and were detected by the array off Juan de Fuca Strait. And the reason I bring this example up is that if you had enough tags on, you could conceivably get a pretty good idea about the migration timing of the adults coming back of a stock like cultus sockeye. I mean, it would cost you a considerable amount of money, but you cannot do that with genetics because of the needle in the haystack problem of a few cultus mixed around a bunch of other stocks. So here's an example of a stock that's in trouble, conservation unit, where knowledge of when it's present in the marine area where fisheries are planned would be very valuable. But of course, you have to put more than 100 tags on it, obviously, because you only had 2 back. But you could conceivably do it. It's feasible, but it would be costly.
There are groups working on making the tags smaller, and really what's going on is not to do with the electronics anymore than it is to do with batteries. And there's a new tag that will allow us to tag down to about 9.5 centimeters, which people think is stretching it. But you could do the same thing. You could ask the tag to only function for about a month, let it go to sleep for 2 years, and then turn it back on when the animal's coming back. It's the exact same thing as Mike's talking about, but the way this tag would be manufactured, it's much more open market, and people are thinking that if we buy large volumes, you can start getting the price down so we could tag more fish. And that the real value of the study last year with Choco was to actually, for the first time, tag fish that are strictly wild. They were never put in a hatchery. These are just a subsample of the smolts because they're by far the largest of the smolts, but they're strictly wild fish. So if we could get the tag down to if we could tag to 9 to 10 centimeters with this tag, then you could get into an area. Even that won't allow you to tag all the populations. I mean, the fish coming out of Quesnel Lake, for example, you'd never be able to put a tag on like that. So it's not going to be a panacea of new studies, but you could apply it in some areas.
Right. And one last question again.
Can I just ask, just before we adjourn for lunch, the program you're talking about, is that the program that we saw at the beginning of the commission's hearings when it was Mr. Welch was
David Welch, that's exactly some of the data from that program. Exactly it, yeah.
The one last question I would like to ask is again relates to the recommendation. So it's Exhibit 14, page 71. And this is a recommendation from John Fraser's report in 2005. You see the number 5, that they recommend that DFO explore application of new technology to collect information on stock levels in ocean areas. And if you move to the DFO response column under the heading Subsequent Actions, second paragraph, it's a 1-line, says starting in the mid-1990s, hydroacoustic technology was tested in Johnson Strait. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. Did that happen? What was tried, and did it work? Is it worth pursuing?
Yeah, so I'll try. I'm more familiar with the most recent work, but there were a number of folks. Almost all of this work was based out of a number of scientists based out of IOS, the Institute of Ocean Sciences in Sydney. David Farmer is a name that comes to mind. There was a gentleman named Mark Trevorrow, I think, that was doing some of this work. And they have explored a number of different hydroacoustic techniques, and I'm going to have a hard time remembering the details on this because I wasn't directly involved with these programs, but even things like Doppler radar, long-range sonar, all these kinds of potential applications were tried back then. And then more recently through the Southern Boundary Restoration Enhancement Fund, so this would have been 2007 or 2008, a gentleman named Sven Vagel who was I think a consultant based through iOS, led a program in Discovery Passage to look at the applications of long-range acoustics to measure salmon passage in that area. As far as I know, there's nothing ongoing right now. Challenges would probably be fairly obvious and intuitive to you. Johnson Straits is very highly tidal, so fish can be fluxing back and forth, so that's a challenge you have to deal with. Always with acoustics pretty well, you have to deal with the species composition sampling because you get an acoustic signal, but it doesn't tell you which species. So Sven's report is actually available on our website. All the Southern Endowment Fund reports are available on our website, so I'd direct you to that for more details, but there have been explorations. High potential value, it's one of these things I'd probably put in the R&D category. It's like it's always good to keep apprised of these developments because sooner or later what you thought was impossible turns out to be very possible, but not there yet in terms of our capability to make it sort of feasible in an implementation phase would be my view of where it is right now. And I don't know if Brian, if you wanted to add to that.
No, your recall is pretty good. I mean, when we look at Johnson Strait hydroacoustically, it is a very, very challenging environment. There is a great deal of background noise. There's so much background noise that when we were designing the juvenile program last year, it was the assessment of David Welsh and Kintama that runs a lot of these arrays that they could not put even a post receiver in Johnson Strait and actually trust the information back. And the other thing that they've discovered is that there's actually quite a bit of bubbles entrained in the water in Johnson Strait because of the extent of turbulence and mixing and that. So, I mean, a number of these things were tried and that, and the staff at iOS are expert in this because of their work in marine hydroacoustics for a number of applications and that, and really not too much has really proven to be fruitful yet.
If work was done and it was some of the challenges in Johnson Strait or in a marine area were overcome, what would be the advantage of that kind of hydroacoustic sample?
Same kind of thing relative to the value of a test fishery versus a mission in river program. It's the volume of fish that are sampled. It's the actual number of targets that are part of the sample that's the critical part. So as I said yesterday, I think talking about test fisheries, we probably catch on average about 0.5% of the fish going by from one test boat in Johnson Straits. Potentially, if you could develop this technology, you could get up into the 10, 15, 20% range pretty easily given where we've been in the river. So that kind of a difference, an order of magnitude difference in the sample size has a very big impact on accuracy and precision. But we have all these challenges, of course.
Right. And then just to close off, I just wanted to flag in the exhibit marked now as Exhibit 360 at pages, 15, 16 on ringtail, which is, page 9 in the actual document. There's a reference to Sven Vagel's hydroacoustic estimation for salmon and marine waters. That's what you're referring to?
That's exactly it, yeah, that's right. And this report is actually available. The more detailed report is available.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.
Yes, we're coming back. 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 We're coming back.